Hello, hi, and welcome. If you are new here, my name is Sarah, and this is Wicked Reading. We have gathered here today to talk about the books that I read in November, so let's get into it. I always start my wrap-up videos with my stats, which I just keep track of through Storygraph. I typically will then talk about the books in the order of which I read them, but we're going to switch it up today. I have a DNF that I will talk about first, and then we're going to talk about the books from lowest rated to highest rated, because November was a mixed bag. I had the most low-rated books that I've had in a single month for sure, maybe even ever. We have a few 2.5 stars, which I don't really tend to give away. I'm a very forgiving reader for the most part, but I was just being real picky this month, and I had some 2 and 2.5 stars, okay? So we're gonna go in order of how I rated them. I do have 1 5-star, but let's talk about the stats. So for the stats, I ended up reading 10 books / 11 books because I did DNF the 11th one, which we'll talk about. But on Storygraph, it's just counting the books that I actually read and finished, and that was 10 books, equating to 3,980 pages. My top moods, which I feel like this is always my top mood, but my very top mood is dark. And then we have tense, mysterious, which I see those a lot too. We have some adventurous, we have emotional, we have funny, and then for the very first time this year, I have lighthearted. But we'll talk about what book that's referring to later on. And I don't typically share my page numbers, but I did notice that I had quite a bit of medium range books. 70% of my books were between 300 and 499 pages, and then 20% of my reads were 500 plus pages, and only 10% was less than 300 pages. So I read some pretty thick novels this month, which is kind of why I tend to have a lower book count. I don't really read very many novellas. I want to read more, but for some reason, the shorter the book, the more I put it off, because I'm just like, it's not going to take me that long to read it. So I just continually put it off and never read novellas. But anyways, my top genres are horror, followed by fantasy with some LGBTQIA+, a little bit of historical, some thriller, and very lastly, we have one romance book. Although arguably more than one book included some romance elements, but one was very much just a romance book. So I only rated the books that I finished, and so my average rating came out to be 3.6 stars, which isn't horrible, but like I said, we have way more 2 and 2.5 stars than I typically have. So let's talk about them. So first, I will talk about the book I DNF'd, and that was Lost Souls by Poppy Z. Bright. This author now goes by a different name, but they still write in their pen name Poppy Z. Bright. But this book, I gave a really good chance to. I got 40% of the way into it, and I'm not hard DNFing it, but I would need somebody to convince me to pick this back up. So this book, the whole premise is sex, blood, and rock and roll. We are following multiple characters, a group of 3 vampires, another lonesome vampire in New Orleans, a young kid, I think he's 15, whose name is Nothing, and 2 young men, I think that they're young 20s, named Ghost and Steven, and they're we follow them doing different things. I don't know. And they're all messed up in some ways. I don't even know what the premise was given to us as, because I just went into this book. It says, at a club in Missing Mile, North Carolina, the children of the night gather, dressed in black, looking for acceptance. Among them are Ghost, who sees what others do not, Anne, longing for love, and Jason, whose real name is Nothing, newly awakened to an ancient, deathless truth about his father and himself. Okay, so what it's talking about with this Missing Mile part was I was just getting into that point because all these people gather and cross paths at this place, at this city, pretty much. And it was just getting there. So to start the premise off with that, it takes a little bit for the book to even get into that territory. But anyways, it has to do with vampires and stuff like that. And we follow these people. It's very character driven and just peeking into people's lives as they, I don't know, grapple with who they are, their emotions. It's kind of like coming of age-ish feeling, but again, I didn't finish it. So I got 40% of the way in. The writing is pretty good. Like, it's very compelling writing. I did annotate a couple of things because I liked the way that some stuff was like said and written. The writing's nice, but my problem with this book is, while I don't mind how sexually charged it is, and you should know that it is extremely sexually charged, I didn't mind that until there were multiple scenes where underage kids were involved with older people and incest became a thing. Now I might be able to look past a single scene of that, or if it was like kind of like for a purpose, like if this character was abused as a child and that's kind of like their backstory, but that's not what the book's about, like it's about something else or something like that. It's kind of like in the background more so. I don't need it written on page, and I don't want to read about incest either. So, didn't like that at all. So it was like maybe the third or fourth scene that I was just like, no, there's too much of this. I can't look past it anymore. I can't pretend that I didn't read it. If you keep making me reread different scenes about it, no. So, I decided to DNF it. I will say the character Ghost, I am so compelled by him. That's the one character I'm very interested in and would love to know what the rest of his story is. But he's not necessarily in this book enough for me to keep going, at least from what I've read. We've maybe had 3 or 4 scenes with Ghost involved within 142 pages. So he's just like not the majority of the story, so it's not worth it. I don't really necessarily care about a lot of the other plot lines that I was at the time reading, so it's a DNF. I might be able to be convinced to pick it back up, but honestly probably not. So I gave it a shot and I'm DNFing, which I'm proud of myself for DNFing because I don't DNF very often. I feel like I'm pretty good at being able to pick books that I don't feel the need to DNF. But as I say that, let's talk about my first 2-star book. So this pained me, and this isn't a vlog, so I'm not going to talk about it super in depth. Just gonna keep it short and sweet here. But I gave 2 stars to Cackle by Rachel Harrison. I know. I feel horrible, and I hated that I hated it. I hated that I hated it because so many of my lovely booktube friends love this book, but it wasn't for me. So the premise of this book is that we are following Anne. Is it Anne or Annie? Annie. We're following Annie, who has recently gotten out of a very long-term relationship, not because of her. Like, she didn't want the breakup to happen. She was broken up with. And it was like 8 years. So now she has to kind of figure out who she is, what to do. So she decides to take a teaching job in a very small, quaint town, moving from like Manhattan. So very much different lifestyle change. And she runs into a woman in this small town named Sophie, and all the townspeople have very mixed reactions to Sophie. Some of them kind of like kiss her ass almost and think Sophie is the greatest person in the world, while other ones seem very off-put by Sophie. So these women end up having like a friendship, and witchy stuff is involved in this book. It is a witch book. I read it in my witchy vlog. So yeah, I did not enjoy this book, even like a little bit, and I feel so bad. But the whole foundation of this book I didn't like. So this book is very much character driven, and very much about this relationship between females, and I love that. So this should be right up my alley. Problem, I hated the main character. She was just way too self-pitying, self-deprecating, constantly putting herself down. It was 95% of this book, if not more. So I was just like, I can only take so much of that. So I don't want to continue to read about somebody hating themselves and blah, 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 whatever. And then the female relationship, the friendship, I didn't like either. It felt very unequal, manipulative. It felt very codependent. Like, the main character is very codependent. And I just couldn't. I didn't like the character, didn't like the relationship. So there was nothing left for me to like about this book, which is why it gets a 2-star. The one thing that I did like was Ralph. Ralph is a little character in this book that I loved. He was super cute. And it does have some of those autumnal, small town vibes. It gave me like a little dash of Gilmore Girls, but it did not make up at all for all the other stuff. So 2 stars. I talk about it more in my vlog if you're interested. Then moving on to Edenville by Sam Riebeling. I don't know if that's how you say it. But so this I read for Amy Noel's Dark Hearts Book Club book pick for November. No, for October. I think this was technically the October pick, but the live show didn't happen until November, so I snuck it in for November. Anyways, the premise is we are following a character named Cam. He ends up writing a horror novella based on a dream that we open up this book with. The book doesn't end up being as successful as he was hoping, but he does end up getting offered a temporary teaching job. I forget what they call it, like resident teacher, I don't know. Anyways, he gets like this temporary teaching position to teach in this creative writing program at a college in Edenville. His girlfriend Quinn is very much kind of on the fence about going. She says Edenville is very weird. A lot of people disappear and just the vibes are off. So Quinn's not really about it, but they end up going anyway, and yeah, weird stuff happens. This book is very hard cosmic and very, very weird and very gross. It is very gross. And not like in a fun, gory kind of way, like Cotton Candy Massacre is like super heavy gore and body horror. This is really gross with like body fluids, which just like, ugh, so many fluids happen in this book. And the writing was not for me at all. In my vlog where I talk about this, I read a couple of lines from the book, and that's a lot of what the book is. I will say there were some elements to this book that I liked, but there was a lot of elements and a lot of people, and I found myself not really liking most characters. Quinn was the best, but even Quinn annoyed me a lot. She was very forgiving and very patient with Cam, and Cam's an asshole, so I was like, girl, leave him, go home, get out of there. But anyways, Quinn was like the best, but she still wasn't amazing. And yeah, so I didn't like any of the characters. There was a lot of elements, which I did like a couple, but most I did not like. It felt a little messy sometimes. And I also don't think that Cosmic's for me. I haven't read many Cosmic, and I don't think that this is a good one to start if you're just getting into Cosmic, because like I said, it's very hard Cosmic. There's a lot going on, and I didn't like it. So 2 stars. Next up, I listened to the audiobook for Silver Nitrate by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. Followed 2 main characters, Tristan, which I'm saying very white, I know, Tristan and Montserrat. So we follow these 2 characters. Montserrat is like an audio engineer, very much into horror movies, classic horror movies, very filmography, audio person, likes that stuff. And Tristan is an actor who also does voiceovers. So they're friends, and eventually Tristan ends up running into one of his neighbors who turns out to be a director from back in the day and filmed a movie that Montserrat is very curious about because it never ended up being finished, and she's very into like the lore of filmography, all of that. And then this director starts to tell them stories about during this filming of this movie, there was a guy on set that was an actor, and it turns out he was like super into magic and occult and stuff like that. So it takes this turn of being all about this magic stuff, and yeah. So I just didn't really care about this book at all. The problem for me was that a lot of the setup, I'm talking like 50% of this book, was just info dump. It was just characters telling characters about other characters, and it was so like far disconnected that I just didn't care. This type of formatting then does not create any amount of tension for me as a reader. So by the time we get really deep into the book and stuff starts happening, I didn't care. I did not care at all. There was so many like Montserrat reading letters that was explaining this character's backstory and like explaining how this magic works, and it was just so info dumpy. It felt instructional, and so I didn't really get any enjoyment out of it. And like I said, by the time stuff happened, there was no tension, so I didn't really care about anything that happened to any of the characters. And yeah, it was whatever. It wasn't like bad. It wasn't horribly written, but just nothing about it interested me or kept me engaged. In the very last chapter though, the term silly tomato is used. The last chapter, I wish didn't happen. The last chapter almost made me hate this book, but I will stand by giving it 2.5 stars, wherein like it didn't offend me in any way. Silly tomato almost did, but it didn't. It wasn't like offensive or gross or like, I don't know. It didn't make me mad. I never got mad about anything in this book. I just like did not care. I've never had less feeling towards the book. I'd almost rather it have made me mad in some capacity, but it just kind of happened. Very forgettable. Just, I probably should have DNF'd it, but since I was listening to the audiobook, I just kept it playing. I was just like, whatever, just get through it so I can talk about it, I guess. But yeah, nothing stands out, 2.5. The next 3 books were all also part of my witchy vlog, so we're gonna breeze right through these. And next is Slewfoot by Bram. In this book, we follow our main character, Abatha. She has married into the Puritan religion lifestyle, and she's very much an outcast. She's not the perfect Puritan woman, and eventually her husband, who is very sweet and I loved him, he does die. So she becomes like a widow. And at the same time, an ancient being awakens from a long slumber by these magic folk in the forest, and he has to kind of figure out who he is, what his purpose is, and this like magical being and Abatha eventually cross paths, and Abatha pretty much eventually takes revenge on this Puritan people who really start to go after her after her husband dies, and they want to call her a witch and stuff like that. Right off the bat, the imagery, the art in this book, stunning, beautiful, gorgeous. All of the artwork is done by Bram. He has a very imaginative imagination, whatever. He's very creative, and I really did enjoy this book and have a lot of fun with it. I really liked Abatha. I really liked her as a character. I was rooting for her, and the whole, you know, revenge storyline. I'm all about revenge. Now, what went bad with this book for me was Samson, who is a very key person in this book. He was just very dull to me. He had like no personality, and he got very annoying to me, honestly. He just kind of kept repeating the same thing. And that was a really, really big letdown. And I also did really enjoy the magical parts of this book where we were following the magic folk. But I will say it did get a little bit, it just felt a little bit like it was forced together. Like those 2 plots were forced together, where Abatha is with these human Puritans, and then this ancient being woken up with these magic folk and this magical, fantastical part of this book. It felt like 2 separate stories being forced together, and I was a bit confused in the beginning because we kind of flipped chapters between Abatha and this magical part, and I just like didn't really understand how it connected. Even like timeline wise, I didn't know if we were like, if it was happening at the same time. I didn't read the synopsis going into it. It just felt a little bit disjointed sometimes. And this like fantastical magical part of it was like really cool, and I wish that we would have almost gotten that more flushed out. I feel like this book either needed to be longer to better get into that magical part of it, or shorter and have the magical folk stuff kind of in a separate story on its own. And like kind of meet somewhere in the middle with like the ancient creature and stuff. But yeah, so I had very mixed feelings about this book, and I know a lot of people just immediately give it 5 stars and love it, and I wish I felt compelled to love it and give it 5 stars. But like I said, Samson was a big letdown, but the last like 100 pages of this book, fantastic. I loved how the story like came together in the end. I love how this story ended with Abatha, but it was just a little bit of that middle portion. I think the middle area is where it got a little bit shaky for me, but I did really like it, and I do really recommend it. I thought it was a really fun time, really cool and unique. I do think that maybe if I reread it physically, I should have said I did end up mostly listening to this on audiobook, and I do think maybe if I reread it physically, on reread it might get a higher rating from me, knowing my expectations should be low for some of the characters, I guess. But yeah, maybe reread it might be higher, but my immediate kind of reaction was more like a 3.5. I grappled a lot in the vlog between giving it like a 3.5 or a 4-star. It's somewhere in there, but yeah, it wasn't a 5-star like I thought it would be, so it was a little bit disappointing, but I still did really enjoy it, so I don't want to make it seem like I'm only talking negatively about it. The beginning, bangin', the end, bangin', really liked Abatha. And like the human Puritan part of it, just wish I got more of the magical folk and a way better personality from Samson. I said I wasn't gonna get all into it, but I kind of did, but yeah, Slewfoot. Then we have the Once and Future Witches by Alex E. Harrow. This is like a historical fiction with witches and magic, but it's really interesting. I really liked the way that the story was approached. So we're in the year of 1893 during like the suffragist movement. I'm just gonna read this because I'm not even gonna try to explain it honestly. It says, in 1893, there's no such thing as witches. There used to be in the wild, dark days before the burnings began, but now witching is nothing but tidying charms and nursery rhymes. If the modern woman wants any measure of power, she must find it at the ballot box. But when the Eastwood sisters, James Juniper, Agnes Amaranth, and Beatrice Belladonna, joins the suffragists of New Salem, they begin to pursue the forgotten words and ways that might turn the women's movement into a witches' movement. Stalked by shadows and sickness, hunted by forces who will not suffer a witch to vote, and perhaps not even to live, the sisters will need to delve into the oldest magics, draw new alliances, and heal the bond between them if they want to survive. Okay, so yeah, I'm just gonna give you guys that because there is kind of a lot going on in this book. There's quite a bit of elements, but I overall did really enjoy it. The writing's really pretty. There was a lot of moments where I wish I had my annotating supplies with me so I could actually like highlight and mark things. I mostly listened to this on audiobook, and overall I liked the themes. I liked what the book had to say a lot of the time, but I will say that it could have maybe been on the shorter side. I think a couple of the things could have been cut out. There was a lot going on. It is a very action-packed book. At times it felt a little bit passive action, not necessarily on page, but there was still a lot of action, a lot of stuff going on. We have quite an array of characters, and we're following 3 sisters, so it's a lot of story. Not everything held my attention because there was just kind of a lot, but I did like it. In the end, I decided to give it a 4-star on my story graph. Really great, really enjoyed it, recommend it. And then after that, we have our one and only true romance, and that is A Witch's Guide to Fake Dating a Demon by Sarah Hawley. This one I'll keep super short, I promise. I really liked it. It was a fun time. I don't have much to say about it. So the title kind of immediately tells you what the synopsis is, but we do end up following our main character named Mariel Spark, and she is a prophesized witch. The stars told her mother that she was going to be extremely powerful, but she is in her young 20s, I think, and she's struggling with her magic, unless it has to do with plants. She's a really big plant witch, really big plant person, and is very powerful when it comes to plant magic, but her mother doesn't really appreciate or respect that and thinks she should be doing much more impressive things. So she is baking, and because she's not very great at her magic, she ends up accidentally summoning a demon who is a soul bargainer, and he cannot leave her until she gives him his soul, of which she does not want to give him. So they are both kind of in this forced proximity situation, and romance ensues. I thought it was really fun, sweet, cute, funny. I liked the characters. I liked the romance. It was fun. I don't have much to say about it. It was a nice, fun time. It was a really great book to switch it up with because I was just feeling very unsatisfied with a lot of my books, and this was just a nice kind of reset book. There are going to be, or are already, 2 other books for this series that follow different characters in this world. I'm really excited for the sequel. The 3rd one sounds okay. I might give it a go, but the sequel I'm excited because we follow Mariel's best friend, who is very spunky and sassy and does not hold back, and I really liked her. Fun time, fun fluff, enjoyed it. If you're curious, it does get spicy. After that, I listened to the audiobook for The Devil Takes You Home by Gabina Iglesias. This book is dark, so I didn't really expect it to be super dark, but it is. I'm gonna read you guys the synopsis because I don't know what it tells you and I don't want to give anything away. So it says, buried in debt due to his young daughter's illness, his marriage at the brink, Mario reluctantly takes a job as a hitman, surprising himself with his proclivity for violence. After tragedy destroys the life he knew, Mario agrees to one final job: hijack a cartel's cash shipment before it reaches Mexico, along with an old friend and a cartel insider named Wonka. But the path to reward or ruin is never as straight as it seems. So yeah, I mean, it's very character driven. You're very much just kind of following Mario as they pretty much prepare to do this big job. They have to go to this place and then they have to meet this person and talk to that person. So you're following them leading up to this like big crime that they're supposed to do, this big payout. And that's like the very end of the story. So it's very much about their journey getting there and Mario's like personal journey and stuff. And it's very dark. There's a lot of torture that you witness. Kids are involved in some cases, which there's a scene in there that I think will forever live with me. And it's not an easy listen to or easy read. So go in knowing that. And everybody's very kind of gray morality. Mario gets involved in drugs and like there's kind of a lot. It's very dark. It takes on a lot of dark stuff, grief, racism, poverty, guilt, sadness, just pretty much every bleak conversation you can have, any bleak emotion these characters are involved in. So it's a bleak book. Yeah, I don't know, but it was really good. I will say the messaging was a bit heavy-handed at times, but very powerful, very moving, and overall 4 stars. Next up, we have Empire of Storms by Sarah J. Maas. I gave this 4.5. This is the 5th book in the Throne of Glass series, so I can't really say much about it, but I will say this installment is very, first, it's huge. A lot happens in this book, and don't ask me a single thing that happened in this book. I do remember it being very battle driven. So if you've listened to any of my wrap-ups where I talk about the Throne of Glass series, I have very much the same thing to say, and that is I'm just having a very weird interaction and weird journey with the Throne of Glass series. I really enjoy the books for the most part. This first one was like whatever, but for the most part, I really enjoy the books and the story as I'm reading it and I'm involved in it. But the second that I shut the book or finish the book, I feel like I don't remember anything. It was a good experience while I was reading it, and I gave it a 4.5 because I do feel like I've probably enjoyed this the most. And my other highest rated one is a 4-star, and I feel like I enjoyed this most. It had the most like gag moments and the most reveals, and it does get spicy finally in this book if you're curious about that. Yeah, so I did really enjoy it, and I like the characters that we were involved in with this book and all of that, so 4.5, but I don't remember a single thing about it. Next up, this is actually the last book that I read in November. Not the last one we're going to talk about, but the last book that I did read in November, and that is My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. This has been really anticipated for me. I've been putting it off. 1, because it's so anticipated, and 2, Stephen Graham Jones, his writing is very unique, and the only other book I've read from him is The Only Good Indians, and that one took me a long time for my brain to understand what he was saying and to get into his writing style. So I was a little bit apprehensive just because I wanted to make sure I had a big brain moment and my brain was turned on high so that I'd be able to consume his content. But I will say this book seemed a lot more approachable writing wise compared to The Only Good Indians. So I just want to say that. In this book, we follow our main character, Jade. She is very into Stephen King, very into horror slasher movies, and she believes that her town is now in the middle of like a slasher film. And that's all I'm going to say. This is a very character-driven book. While it is a slasher, it's not a very actiony slasher until like the last 100 or 150 pages or so. Most of this book is following Jade, and it's so interesting because it felt like stream of consciousness, but it's in third person, but the writing felt very stream of consciousness. And it just like, I don't know, his writing style is just so unique. I've never really had much of that experience with anything else. I really liked the writing. I really liked Jade, and I love horror slashers. So that whole the whole concept was really fun for me. And I really ate this book up. I read it very fast. The only reason it's not a full 5 stars is one, there was a chapter, I think it was like the birthday chapter or something. There was a chapter that just kind of threw me off a little bit because the characters were just kind of like, they just felt like they were reacting very weird. And I felt like people weren't saying what they should have been saying or reacting the way they should have been reacting. Everyone was just it was just like a bizarre chapter, but it did throw me off. And I will say, I do think it could have been slightly shorter. I think some of the stuff was slightly repetitive. The very last chapter felt very unnecessary for the most part. There was like a moment of symbolism that I really liked, that I felt was like a nice little finish. But yeah, there was like, I don't know, I feel like we could have got there a little bit differently. And also, I'm very interested in how and why this is a trilogy. So I'm very curious where the sequel is going to go. I could see this just being a standalone. So I'm very curious where that second book's going to take me. So yeah, really enjoyed it. Had a great time. Just tiny little things in it that threw me off a little bit, but had a fantastic time. Loved the writing, but this really isn't going to be for everybody. Throughout it, we do get these essays that Jade writes where she's kind of like analyzing slashers. So I really liked that too. I think if you're a fan of slashers, this would be really fun. I don't know what else to say. I really liked it. Had a great time. 4.5. And finally, my only 5-star for the month goes to Our Hideous Progeny by C.E. McGill. For a while, this was going to be a 4.5 star, but the author's note is what just bumped it up to a 5-star for me. So I did listen to this on audiobook, and the audiobook was fantastic. I highly recommend the audiobook. So in this book, we're following our main character, Mary, who is like, I think a great niece or a great niece of Victor Frankenstein. So we're in the year 1853, so it's very historical feeling, very historical fiction. And Mary is married to a man named Henry, and they're both very into paleontology and science. And Mary is a woman, so she doesn't really have any ability to do anything with her hobby, but Henry is like a actual scientist. She helps Henry out a lot with their pursuit of paleontology. So it was just a really good book. I really enjoyed it, but I will say we don't even hear mention of Victor Frankenstein until maybe like 30% of the way in. It is a very slow building book. It's very character driven. We're learning a lot about Mary and Henry, their relationship, and the way Mary's treated within the scientific field and what her interests are and all of that. So we get very deeply embedded into these characters before we even learn about this Victor Frankenstein. So she does end up finding letters from Victor Frankenstein, and they decide to pursue a similar experiment that Victor Frankenstein did, but they go about it very differently, and they're very much in the mindset of paleontology, so it takes on a very different kind of like approach that I really liked. This is supposed to be what really makes their career and kind of will solidify them to go down in history and be in textbooks and be taken very seriously as scientists and all of that. So I really enjoyed it, but it is very much a slow burn. It's very character driven. We do end up getting some female relationship stuff going on too, which I really liked. It's very kind of like between the lines. Stuff does happen on page, but it's mostly between the lines because of like the era that we're in. And I don't know, I really liked the themes. It had a lot to do with women in STEM back then, and I just really enjoyed being so immersed in the science part of it. That's what I felt so much more interested in when I originally read Frankenstein, is having it been written before so many scientific advances and discoveries. That's what really interests me about those times. And historically speaking, I'm in the science field. I'm very into science. So to like kind of have a historical approach where we're embedded in the scientific field in the 1850s is just really interesting to me. But it's not going to be for everybody. I will say it is kind of science heavy, but it's not like a boring science. It's paleontology, a little bit of geology, but it does delve into like science stuff, into a lot of feminist themes with how women were treated back then, and the idea of like marriage and all of that. I don't know. I really liked it. I really enjoyed it. I highly recommend it. It is definitely a book that I would reread, so I definitely want to get myself a physical copy of it because the cover is absolutely stunning as well. But yeah, had a great time with it. So that is going to be everything for this video. That is all the books that I read in November. Let me know in the comments down below what your favorite read of November was and what your least favorite read was. I would love to know. If you made it all the way to this point in the video, leave me a lizard emoji down below so that I know. As always, thank you so much for spending some of your time with me while I sit down and talk about books. If you haven't yet, please give the video a like, subscribe for future content, turn on the bell notification, all the fun YouTube things that help your girl out, and I will catch you guys in the next video.